Welcome to Burning Platforms, a fortnightly podcast from the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. I'm Peter Lewis, the Director of the Centre. This week we'll be joined by author and commentator extraordinaire Paris Marx to discuss their new book, Road to Nowhere. But first, our regular catch-up on the latest in the world of politics and tech with Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Guardian Australia Managing Director Dan Stinton. Hello everyone, welcome to Burning Platforms. The format is 3 stories in the news and then a deep dive where we're going to go into Paris's new book, Road to Nowhere, about all things technology and automotive. Before we get there though, we get an amazing little aggregation from the wonderful Amy Denmead, but I don't think we've had a fuller stack of stories to go through for a while, Lizzie, and we've been changing what we wanted to talk about almost by the hour. And a lot of them are about Meta this week. So we might spend a little bit of time talking about Meta. There's been a very inspirational video that's been released by Mark Zuckerberg, the Meta Connect, which if you've got a spare hour and a half, it's better than most blockbusters on Netflix. And there's a lot of moving parts there we might talk about in a minute. But before we get to that, Meta's also been in the news for allowing censorship in India and then getting busted lying about it. What's going on there?
I love this story. It's quite juicy. So essentially what happened is an Indian tech news outlet, The Wire, claimed that Meta had permitted a post to be taken down on Instagram that was critical of a BJP leader. So the BJP is obviously the ruling party in India. And this was supposedly done by their chief propaganda officer, essentially talking to Meta about the claim is that the post should be taken down, and it was taken down. And it wasn't entirely clear what kind of community standards had been violated by the post. So there was a suspicion that it was political censorship. So The Wire published this story, and Andy Stone, who's their PR guy, public policy guy in Washington, D.C., strongly refuted the reporting, claimed that the email that The Wire was using as evidence of this claim was fabricated. And then almost immediately after, a leak came again from Meta, which indicated that Andy Stone had been emailing about how the actual original email had been leaked. So essentially busted for making an accusation that the evidence was fabricated when it wasn't. And it sort of doesn't surprise me that they've fallen into error or put their foot in it when it comes to public policy and PR. But yeah, I think it's just an appalling little example of lying to the public about what they do. But also, I think it is a really interesting question how much these platforms censor and how much we don't see what happens behind the scenes. I'm pretty confident that Meta does this semi-regularly, has a pretty good relationship with some of these authoritarian regimes where they're allowed to have their business running. But, then on the other hand, Meta loves to talk about how they're pro-free speech and they don't like taking down content. And, there's a lot of right-wing content that is accelerated by the platform, and the bias, if anything, seems to be towards the right and conservatives, and that's kind of justified on free speech grounds. So once again, they're being inconsistent in their politics and ethics, and they've just happened to be busted for it this time.
There's another one that I don't quite know what we make of. There was a court case running in San Francisco involving OnlyFans, which is a subscription site for people that like to go deeper into other people's lives. Is that a fair description? But unnamed Meta employees have been accused of working under the table to secretly aid OnlyFans by blacklisting competitors. And then I don't know if we can repeat the names, but a number of very high-profile execs were inadvertently named in papers this week, which have ended up in a number of media stories. And I guess the common thread here is the policies that this massive platform implements to justify or manage the power of their ubiquity is now seemingly becoming a matter for the courts in a whole bunch of different ways around the world.
The accusation is that Meta permitted OnlyFans content and blacklisted other sites. OnlyFans it's true, you can go deeper into people's lives. You don't have to be making adult content, but that is where a lot of people who make adult content, that's the platform that they use. So Meta's also been known for being a bit prudish when it comes to deplatforming certain kinds of content. The allegation is that certain officials took bribes in order to allow OnlyFans content to remain there by giving OnlyFans a kind of monopolistic control of that market at the expense of other sites that did the same thing. I mean, I've never seen a situation where lawyers have filed documents that they intended to redact and didn't, and then it's such a significant set of people who've been named by it. But I don't think there's anything wrong because it's been reported in the press, but I don't know whether we'll be
Nick Clegg.
Yeah. There you go, you've done it.
Oh, I've done it.
Yeah, and the bribery, as alleged, is pretty bad. Like sums of money going to somebody's kid, apparently, or an account in somebody's kid's name. So you do wonder how this platform has allowed something like that to happen. It's supposed to be professional. This is Nick Clegg's a former deputy prime minister in the UK. It's a pretty serious allegation if he's taking bribes and allowing an internet economy to be influenced pretty significantly as a result.
So with all these moving pieces, Dan, the Meta Connect video, which some would read as, I don't know, whoever was playing Mark Zuckerberg's a really bad actor, I'll just say, but almost...
What is your favourite bit? What's your favourite bit?
Like it's a plaintive cry to make the metaverse real, and if we just believe it enough. And look, my favourite or my scariest bit is two of my least favourite things, Meta and Teams merging together to create a version of virtual meeting hell. But I guess rather than just taking pot shots at a pretty bad but highly produced video, Dan, if Meta is involved in so many court cases at the moment just about the managing of their existing data, this big data play of building the entire infrastructure that everyone apparently is going to live their life, including teleportation, which is my favorite tech. And I wanted to talk to Paris later about teleportation, but Mark Zuckerberg's claiming teleportation in metaverse as well. Where's your brain going on all this?
My brain is confused, I think it's fair to say, but that's not unusual. I think, look, the common theme of the stories that we discussed at the start of this, I think, is that there is a consistent approach to how Meta conducts content regulation or content moderation and the like, and that is that they will do whatever they need to do to maximize their business interests. So in the US, that means that they'll allow pretty harmful content to proliferate, and not just in the US, but a lot of territories, because that content drives engagement. In India, the laws there are very stringent, but in order for Facebook to do business there, then they need to take down some of this content. So they're basically just doing whatever they need to do to maximize their business interests. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. It's pretty concerning, though, because there's obviously real-world harms that come with this. And the big issue we've got now is that Mark Zuckerberg is making a huge bet that the next computing platform is going to be VR and AR. And, he's not alone there. There's a lot of people that believe that is the case. I'm going to resist the temptation to make fun of the very awkward scripted video that they put out at their
makes us look natural.
It
does make us look good, Peter, which is no small feat.
We don't have legs either, though, I have to say. Although I'm just telling you, I do have legs.
But yeah, look, I think the interesting thing about what came out of this keynote, putting aside the awful video, is the partnership that was announced with Microsoft. And effectively, what this has signaled is that Facebook or Meta have made the decision to go in the direction very similar to what Google have done with the Android operating system. So they basically want their hardware to be the hardware that most consumers use to access the so-called metaverse or use VR. And they really are open to working with any software provider to do that. And that's very different to, I think, how Apple are likely to approach it when they release their headset, because they're going to no doubt try and maximize the sales that they can get on the devices themselves and control the software as well. The reason I think Facebook is making this decision is because if you look at the business model that exists in Facebook and Instagram and the like, it is all about advertising and all about harvesting as much data as you possibly can. And if you partner with Microsoft and, in fact, anyone else, but you control the underlying hardware, then you have the ability to collect a huge amount of consumer data, which you can use for advertising in VR and the metaverse. So I think that's why they're doing this. I'm not surprised that they're going in this direction. I think it's a really massive boon for Microsoft for what it's worth. We'll see whether Meta are successful in bringing more people into VR, because at the moment it's still a fairly nascent play that's mostly gamers. So.
Paris, I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at this piece of vision, but what's your take on the direction that Meta is taking at the moment?
Yeah, I haven't watched the newest keynote yet. I've certainly seen clips as they've floated around, but I think it's concerning to see, the degree to which they're trying to push this on the public, but especially their workforce. There's news stories out recently that Facebook or Meta employees are going to be expected to do more of their work within the metaverse to try to prove that this is something that is actually going to work, right? It's not something that is being kind of adopted by the public because it's interesting or offers a lot of value to people that they want to access, but rather because it needs to be forced onto people through workplace situations in many cases. And it looks like that's what a lot of these companies are going to try to start doing. One thing that kind of stands out to me that maybe bridges a couple of these meta topics, when you go back to his metaverse presentation in November of last year, that really came after the revelations from Frances Haugen around, Facebook telling us a lot about what was going on internally there. And there was a clip at the beginning of that presentation when it was presented live that was then cut out of a lot of the kind of videos of the presentation that went online later, where Mark Zuckerberg kind of talks for a minute or two to address these concerns that are being raised around Facebook at that time. And he really draws on what Mark Andreessen wrote around the beginning of the pandemic when he wrote this essay called It's Time to Build, where he was really kind of championing the power of Silicon Valley and the tech industry. And Mark Zuckerberg essentially said that, there are some people who are concerned about what's happening now, but there are other people who are thinking about the future, right? And who are really concerned about trying to build a better future. And Mark Zuckerberg and the engineers around him were placed in that category. And he said, we're going to get some things wrong, but we're the ones who are thinking about the future, not these people who are like criticizing us and trying to tear us down. And that he, in trying to build the metaverse, was really championing this kind of view. And it's a continuation of what we've seen in the tech industry for a long time, right? This desire to avoid the consequences and the accountability for what they're doing and to keep charging forward with their vision for how society should work and how technology should work in a way that really excludes the desires, the interests, the well-being of everyone else.
Yeah, and part of that superstructure, of course, is the lack of accountability for what appears on platforms. Dan, you've drawn to our attention, there's a Supreme Court case that is looking like they're putting Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act back under the microscope. Do you just want to fill us a bit on what's going on there?
Yeah, I've been obsessing about this story because it's potentially hugely consequential. So to bring everyone up to speed, so last week, the US Supreme Court announced that it would hear a very high stakes tech case against Google. It's a really sad story. So Nohemi Gonzalez was a 23-year-old American studying in Paris, and she was killed by individuals affiliated with the terrorist group ISIS when they opened fire on a cafe where she and her friends were eating dinner. And in the wake of Gonzalez's murder, her family took the curious decision to sue Google on the basis that ISIS posted hundreds of radicalizing videos inciting violence to YouTube, which is obviously owned by Google. And significantly, the Gonzalez family's lawyers also argued that it was YouTube's algorithms that promoted this content to users whose characteristics indicated they would be interested in ISIS's videos, and therefore they bore some responsibility. Now, 2 federal appeals courts have already ruled against the family, but despite this, the US Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case, which I understand is very unusual, but I think this is a very unusual Supreme Court, so I'll put that aside for the moment. This case challenges the protection that internet companies receive under Section 230. And I think most people know about this by now, but just in case, what Section 230 does is it basically ensures that digital platforms are not liable for the content that individual users promote or publish on their platforms, but it also critically allows those platforms to moderate the content without accepting liability for the content. And this is effectively the law that has enabled the modern internet, or Web 2.0, and it's enabled social media and YouTube and the like to flourish. So what I find most interesting about this case is that Google is being held accountable for amplifying this content. So I'm not a lawyer. I'll defer to Lizzie for her legal take on this, but I agree with the view that no platform should be accountable for the content that users create on their platforms. But as soon as a decision is made to amplify one piece of content over another, then that is effectively a publishing decision. And if Google aren't accountable for this, then I'm not sure who could be. I appreciate this is a very wicked problem. I'm not saying there's any easy way through it, but again, I think it comes back to we just need these algorithms have become just too important to remain in the shadows, and there needs to be some transparency around what they're doing and perhaps some greater protections around particularly harmful content. So, but what do others think?
Lizzie?
Yeah, it is a wicked problem. The analogy that's often drawn, or the analogies I should say, is are these platforms like a telephone service where they provide the pipes but don't take responsibility for what happens or what travels down them, or are they a newspaper where they are responsible for all the content and they provide the platform as well? And I think it's actually not clear legally which they are. And in some ways, we're seeing a bunch of different cases around the world to kind of grapple with this decision. At least in Australia, it remains legally unclear. We've had a couple of different decisions that kind of canvass this point in different ways. You know, people may remember the Voller decision about publication of comments on platforms that then are attributable to a publisher like The Guardian. But then also,
I remember it well, Lizzie.
There was another recent decision where search engine results produced in response to a query by somebody, that if they produced defamatory content in the course of that search, the company, well, Google wasn't held liable for that defamation. So then in the course of that decision, one of the judges actually pointed out that if we were talking about ad content where Google is paid to display an ad, they may take a different view on that point. And each of these activities involve automated functionality. Even a search engine result does. But there's varying degrees, I think, in many people's minds about the implication of the company, the platform, in the outcome. I mean, there's also different ways you want to incentivize behavior. Like, obviously, it's different if Google's taking revenue from an ad and then they publish an ad that maybe engages in racial hatred in Australia. I mean, that's not prohibited in the US, but, that might fall foul of our laws here. That feels different to search engine results, which is sort of like a more akin to what you'd assume is a public service, even though it's run by a private company. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer here, but the Supreme Court, the other component here, is just so unpredictable now in the United States that it's very real, a very real possibility that, notwithstanding this is a multi-billion-dollar economy for the US, they may seek to read down Section 230, and there doesn't appear to be a Congress that's functional enough to deal with that, to find a proper alternative in legislative terms. And this would, I do think, radically transform the internet. There would then be a significant onus on some of these platforms to pre-moderate content. I'm not sure they're at all equipped to do that. So it would be a radical transformation of their business model. I mean, I'm for radically transforming their business model. I'd prefer to do it through the privacy vehicle, through limiting the information before it goes into their hands and then they use it to feed an algorithm. But, I can understand the harm that gives rise to these kinds of cases. I'm not sure this is the right tool for solving that problem.
Yeah, Paris, it's hard to overstate how one law has shaped the history of technology, particularly in your country, but also by association around the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, I'm in Canada first off, so not in the United States.
I got my wrong North American there. My apologies.
Totally okay. Yeah, I would say 230 is something that I have kind of made the decision to not weigh in on too much. I think generally, I think that there's a good argument to be made that there is a good reason to kind of, maybe take a second look at some of these kind of widespread opt-outs or whatnot that have been given to the platforms when it comes to moderation. But I agree with Lizzie's point that I'm worried that if we did that in this environment, that the way that, power structures are set up in the United States right now is you'd have it reshaped in a way that really benefits the right wing and the far right in the United States. So I'm worried. I think generally, yes, like theoretically, that's a conversation that should be had. I'm worried about what it would look like in practice if we actually pursued it.
Because it's interesting to think through what the political drivers for this are going to be, given the current Supreme Court, right?
Britishness, no? I think that's part of it. Go on. Sorry, Dan.
That's right. But putting this case aside, though, I think where Section 230 is inadequate is when it comes to amplification of content. I think we don't want an internet where every single piece of content that a person puts up has to be vetted by some other big company. I think that's a worse internet than what we've got now. But nor do we want a circumstance where the amplification of that content for the purposes of maximizing engagement and advertising dollars is allowed to run without any guardrails, which is the circumstance we find ourselves in now. So that seems to be the area that we need to fix. Again, it's very technical. It's going to be very hard to fix, but they're not publishers, nor are they phone companies. There's something in the middle, but the amplification of the content is where the harm is mostly located. I think that's where we need to start.
But back to our earlier discussion about the metaverse, if those same principles hold, like, is there any platform responsibility for anything that happens in the virtual environment that these guys are going to create?
I think that's a great question. Like, what happens, if someone's sexually assaulted in the metaverse, to what extent do they take responsibility for that? And if they don't take responsibility, and it feels a little bit like there's a decent argument that they're not responsible for that kind of conduct, then they're under no incentive to create safe environments. That's the public policy outcome, right? We need to find a way to incentivize them to take safety of people seriously, while also allowing a flourishing internet. I mean, which is why I keep returning to surveillance capitalism as the key problem, because if you're interested in engagement, that's your business model, you're always going to be prioritizing ongoing participation in the platform, regardless of the harm caused. And that's the critical way to stop it, in my view, rather than necessarily attributing liability for a third party that's used your platform poorly. Philosophically, that's, I think, the better way to approach it. But I understand why there's some drive to hold them accountable, because you want them to have to put in place standards. There's another aspect to this, which is if you get sexually assaulted in the metaverse, you probably won't go there. And like, there's a lot of people who don't like going on Twitter because it's unpleasant. There's a lot of people who don't like going on Facebook because it's full, dare I say, of boomers making, spreading
unless you've got to go in there
misinformation
for work.
Exactly. So there's all those other things, right? But there's an argument that a bad quality platform may not continue. But Facebook is kind of the living example of that not being true. So I think we shouldn't assume that there'll be a market response to this either.
Anyway, we'll be diving deep in the metaverse in a couple more weeks. Sorry, go, Paris.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Just 2 quick points on what Lizzie was saying. I think it's interesting to look at, the metaverse that has been created right now by Facebook. And they, from a PR standpoint, say that they're going to take these actions to make it safer than the Facebook platform that they control right now. Plenty of journalists have gone in there and saw that, the kind of stuff that people are getting away with inside Horizon Worlds and these various platforms that they have inside the metaverse, it's not really lining up with their PR line on what's going on there. And then the other point is really, I've actually lost it. So
must have been a good one, but you come back to it. I'm just going to quickly throw my offering on the table, which is about the politics of the cloud, which sounds like a great piece of literature or something, doesn't it? But it's off a terrific piece from Cecilia Recap from the University of London. I'll put the link in the chat in a sec. Her point is Microsoft and Alphabet are both looking at getting into the cloud to prop up failing earnings. We already know AWS basically underwrites Amazon. As Cecilia writes, together Amazon, Microsoft and Google concentrate around 65% of total cloud infrastructure. The market dominance matters more than concentration in other markets because it entrenches the tech giants' control of digital technologies, which of course reinforces their global power and the value they capture from other businesses in the form of the intellectual rents paid to use the technology. So she ends up calling for something that was music to my ears, which is the idea of thinking about the cloud as public digital infrastructure or public infrastructure, and there'd be a real public interest in thinking through what that might look like. She says, since it's impossible to limit digital learning when processing third-party data, corporations should not be the main and certainly not the only cloud providers. On the contrary, a solution could be to build a cloud operated democratically as an international public consortium. Paris, have you come across any of these thoughts around the clouds? And what's your take?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? I feel like for a long time, we kind of didn't have this critical perspective on the internet and what it allowed, right? The internet rolled out globally. The idea was it's allowing us to access all of this information, connect with people around the world. But we I think for a long time or didn't focus as much on the political economy piece of that, which is that it really allowed some major American companies to spread worldwide and take over technology, internet services in many countries around the world. And now when we look at the expansion of cloud infrastructure, we're seeing that kind of digital colonialism kind of continued. And this is a big concern in a lot of countries around the world where companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon are building these cloud infrastructures, these data centers, so that they control, really what is the storage of the internet around the world, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in New Zealand. I've seen stories about it. I was in France a few months ago, and there was a magazine cover all about the kind of big data centers that were being proposed to be built across France. I think that this is a question that's becoming more and more relevant. And because these major American tech firms have, really accumulated so much wealth over the past number of decades, a whole ton during the pandemic in particular, as we were all using these services, they've been plowing a lot of that money into building out this cloud infrastructure, to buying the underwater internet cables that, kind of link up the world, to control more of the actual infrastructure of the internet itself. And I think that we need to be paying a lot more attention to that moving forward, especially as we're having these conversations around antitrust. And are these companies too big? Do they control too much of the internet and the digital services that we use? Well, this is a really important piece of that. And if we allow them to control the infrastructure of the internet, then I think that's a really worrying proposition for what comes in the future.
Yeah, Dan, for any business, and obviously one your size, the cloud has basically become an unavoidable trading partner.
Yeah, and I should mention as well, I mean, I've got a background in startups, and many of the companies that I was previously involved with, I mean, if it wasn't for the cloud, we simply wouldn't have been able to get these companies off the ground, because what the cloud enables you to do is it effectively means that you don't have to have all of these data storage capabilities yourself, and then when there's a surge in traffic, you effectively can just reap the benefits of that without your site or app going down. So there is a real benefit for that. You can see why they evolved. But to pick up on what Paris was saying, I mean, these are effectively the new versions of the telephone companies or the railway lines, right? Like we're now in a circumstance where the infrastructure of the internet is effectively going to be controlled by 3, maybe 4 big tech companies out of the US. And yeah, I mean, I love the idea of a public company coming up to challenge them. I think that's going to require hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to get there. I would love it if Elon Musk...
Or government procurement.
Or government, perhaps, sure. But, I would love it if Elon turned his attention to that instead of buying Twitter for about $43 billion too much than he should have. But maybe not even. Maybe Elon's not the right person. But my point is, I think it's going to require a huge amount of investment that is going to be difficult for one country even to do. That's the problem. It's going to require a huge amount. So I wonder if it's just better going back to antitrust regulation more in the Brandeisian sort of approach, which is look at the harms that are created, not just to consumer prices, but to control. And therefore, we need to be deeply skeptical about any acquisition that any of that these 3 companies are making, because they're probably doing that based on insights from the data insights they're getting from people using their cloud technology.
Yeah, Lizzie, it's easy to think of the cloud as quite benign. And I always was amazed when I learned that Amazon Web Services was underwriting all the Amazon store, but they're not totally different universes, are they?
No, I would just add to Jordan's comment in the chat, no Elon, anything I think response to Dan's.
Sorry, it was a bad.
We almost got through a whole hour without mentioning it too, so thank you for that.
Oh, Jesus, Dan.
I definitely have to echo that sentiment. Yeah.
My point, which I probably made terribly, is simply that it's going to be hugely expensive for a public infrastructure of any kind, and it's going to. I'm not sure it's practical. Is the problem? That's
yeah, but I mean, surely people say that about trains. Surely people say that about water, sewage, and stuff. Like all public infrastructure is expensive, but you invest in it for a variety of different reasons. Partly because you're worried about large companies dominating the political economy, partly because you're concerned about your national security, like even by their own logic, which is not one that I particularly subscribe to. Wouldn't you be concerned about your data being owned by a company that isn't based here? Like, there's a national security argument against this, so all public infrastructure is expensive. It's just whether you think that there are good reasons or that the market offering is substandard. And I think in this instance it is. I mean, I also think like the development of artificial intelligence relies on data and computing power. And at the moment, it's really a very small number of companies that will dominate the development of artificial intelligence, really any kind of automation. And that's permitted by the fact that Amazon, as being one of these companies, has a huge huge control of data storage and computing power under our current rules and, the way our economy is structured. And so there's implications beyond just how you engage as a business with the cloud. There's also whole industries that will only be able to develop through these companies because of the chokehold they have. Anyway, I could talk about this forever, but then I think we've got more.
Probably time to get onto Paris, but
exactly.
Once we build the public square, we'll build the public cloud.
Yeah, if I could provide an alternative though for thinking about like a public cloud, it doesn't have to be one country like the United States that builds it out for us, right? If we think about the model of, say, the post office, where we all have our national post offices, they provide postal services, and then we have an international agreement where, if it needs to be sent internationally, there's communications with other, postal services to ensure that can happen. I think that there are ways to think about this in a different, a different setup that is maybe more oriented toward what we would want the internet to look like in a different kind of future.
Terrific. Maybe we'll go deep now and almost segue as always. Paris, welcome and congratulations on your new book. Also, congratulations on a fantastic podcast. I know a lot of the people here really enjoy Tech Won't Save Us. I'm interested in kicking off this discussion with a why. Like, why did you decide to anchor your book on the automobile? Because it goes out in so many different directions, but why did you choose that to be the central point of your thesis?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? And, my focus, and when I was originally writing the book and thinking up the book, was really to look at what Silicon Valley had proposed for the future of transportation, right? What in their imagining, how we were going to get around in the future. And it became clear to me that in order to properly assess that, in order to properly analyze that, it wasn't just about looking at what has happened in the past 10 years and what is going on now, but rather to look back much further to the advent of the automobile, to when that really takes hold. I look at North American and American cities in particular, but really how that happens, the process through which it happens, whether it is something that is kind of just inherently welcome because the automobile is, invented, and then kind of the idea I think we generally have is, okay, the automobile exists and then naturally it's going to roll out because this is the new technology. This is what the future of transportation looks like. But actually, when we look back at that history, we can see that there was a lot of opposition, there was a lot of fighting, there was a lot of debate as to how that should proceed, what that future of transportation should look like, to what degree automobiles should be implemented within the city. Obviously in a lot of North American cities, Australian cities, of course, the automobile came to dominate in a really significant way, pushing out a lot of other forms of transportation. But that wasn't written in stone, right? It didn't have to be that way. It wasn't it wasn't kind of predetermined that just because the automobile was invented, that was going to happen. And so I thought that going back and looking at that history really kind of denormalized some of the ideas that we have about the automobile today, and really set it up well to look at what the tech companies are proposing and how in some ways there are extensions between what the auto companies were trying to achieve, in the 20th century, and then what the tech companies are trying to do as they move into transportation in the 21st century.
One of the things that comes through really clearly is the ability to turn a blind eye to the damage of a new technology in the pursuit of the promise.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we see that going back to the automobile as well, right? One of the things that stood out to me is, in the past 10 or 15 years, we've had a lot of narrative around disruption, right? That these tech companies were going to come in and they were going to disrupt the transportation system and many other aspects of society. But I think when we actually look at the way that we get around and we question, what tech companies have done, I don't think they've actually changed a whole lot. Maybe to some, in some ways, instead of calling a taxi or waving one down, you might hail one from your phone now, but that's not really a significant transformation. But when we look back to the early 20th century and mid 20th century, when the automobile was rolling out, that's a real disruption of cities, of city life, of how we exist in the world and in these environments, right? And as you say, there was a lot of, especially in the period when that was happening, a lot of ignoring especially among those in power, of the real downsides of that. The people who were dying on the roads and how that really kicked off a lot of opposition to the automobile. Later the environmental impacts that come of that, what it does to communities, to environments as they're being remade for the automobile. These were a lot of the questions that were really present as these changes were occurring. And we tend not to think about that today as the automobile has become normalized, as it's taken over a lot of, the means through which we get around. But now when we think about the tech companies as well, a lot of what they were proposing was they recognized that there were these really fundamental problems with the transportation system, whether it's the people who are dying on the roads, whether it's the time stuck in traffic, whether it's the contribution to climate change by automobiles, by the transportation system. And they were saying, we have a solution to this problem. We are going to solve it for you by implementing new technologies into the transportation system. And my argument is essentially that when we look at the impact of that, we can see that they didn't tend to solve those problems, and rather they delayed a conversation about real solutions to actually addressing real problems that people have in the transportation system.
Yeah. Ellie, so you go, Lizzie.
Yeah. I find this book it is really radicalizing in some ways, I feel, because once you read it and you start to imagine what our cities could look like as opposed to what they do, you're reminded basically every day of it as you walk out the door when you think about how dominant vehicles are, how dominant automotives are, and what might have been different. But I actually wanted to talk, or to hear you talk a bit, Paris, about Uber. Like one of the more recent developments or articles I saw, I think it was in The Guardian, where they talked about creating barriers to allow to stop pedestrians from crossing the road for fear that they may be hit eventually by an autonomous vehicle. And to allow that technology to exist safely, we would literally create physical barriers for pedestrians because we don't expect autonomous vehicles to be able to detect pedestrians. And it's just, again, the whole physical world is being reshaped around a particular form of technology. But your book as well talks about the death of a jaywalker, shall we say. That's an industry term, a pedestrian who was crossing the road. And I feel like there's very little analysis of this that kind of examines the role of the company and the material inputs that go into creating autonomous vehicles. And I wondered if you could just talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You say, these proposals that we hear every now and then for putting barriers on the sidewalk so that people can't cross and kind of disrupt the autonomous vehicle. There was proposals from Princeton researchers that we should be wearing a little kind of sensors so that the vehicles can pick us up, because they're not always the greatest at doing that. And Balaji Srinivasan, I believe his name is, tweeted recently that we should just be, making roads for self-driving cars, right? And of course, we have this previous experience of remaking the streets for automobiles themselves, right? Pushing off every other form of transportation and making it just for the car. And, one of the things that seemed very clear to me is that if we're ever going to have autonomous vehicles take over the roads, we're really going to have to remake them in a way that works for them. Because the idea that, you're going to have these autonomous vehicles and you're going to have all this kind of other activity happening around them, especially as we've had the realization, the recognition, the admission from many of these companies that, the level 5 autonomous technology, the notion that these cars are going to be able to operate in virtually any environment, any weather, whatever you deploy them in, the recognition is really that that's not going to happen, or if it is going to happen, it's really far down the road. And so, I think that there was a lot of hype around the self-driving vehicle in, the first decade of the 2000s, right? This comes after, I guess people in the industry would know that there was a lot of money being put into the development of self-driving vehicles by the Department of Defense in the United States in the late 1990s. Some of the people who come out of that then enter into, Google's autonomous vehicle program, these other big tech companies' autonomous vehicle programs. Like, you wonder why all these companies are interested in it right around the same time. It's because it's right after the Department of Defense was putting a lot of money into promoting the development of autonomous vehicles, and you had all these, universities that were working on it, all these engineers who were working on it. So naturally, they wanted to get in on it too, because this was the big moonshot, this was the future. And so for a few years, the narrative was really autonomous vehicles are right around the corner. They're going to be here in 5 years, in 2 years, and they're just going to completely upend how we get around, right? They're going to solve all these problems. We're not going to wait in traffic anymore. Transportation is going to be super cheap, and you're just going to hail an autonomous vehicle at any time that you want. No one's going to die on the roads anymore. All these sorts of things are going to be solved because we have this techno solution. Just give us a few more years and we're going to achieve it, right? And then, there were questions, obviously, but there was a general kind of acceptance that this narrative was what was effectively going to happen. Maybe it wasn't going to arrive exactly on time, but it was going to happen. And then 2018, you have the Uber vehicle that kills the pedestrian in Arizona. And overnight, there's kind of a shift in the whole narrative around self-driving technology, around what these companies can deliver. There's a lot of admissions by these companies that actually, this is much further down the line than we were previously saying. The exception to that, of course, is Elon Musk, who still says it's coming. It's next year as he's finally going to release it. And so my real argument is that whole kind of decade-long process of promising us autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, and how it was going to solve all these problems was really a delay tactic so that we didn't take the solutions that were really necessary to solve these problems, that we have the technology for today, that we can use to address the real problems in our cities when it comes to traffic, road deaths, environmental contributions to climate change, all these sorts of things. We can address these things if we make the political decisions to do it, but the techno promise, allows us to avoid having those difficult conversations around politics because the technology is going to solve it if we just wait and let these tech companies do their magic, essentially.
Paris, can I ask, to pick up on that point, perhaps a more hopeful take on things? What could we do? I mean, how could we leverage this moment and the technology capabilities that we do have? If we didn't leave it to the Teslas or Elon Musk or the Ubers of the world, what would you advocate for? How could we make our cities better and less focused around the car that it currently is now, and perhaps better for people?
Absolutely. I think that there's many ways that we can do that. And, just because I criticize the approach of the tech companies is not to say that I don't think there's a role for technology in cities or addressing these problems, right? We just need to ensure that those technologies are developed with the public good in mind, right? With actually solving these real problems, and that we do the proper assessments of the technologies to ensure that they're delivering the benefits that these companies are actually promising us, right? I think part of the problem is that these companies like to come out with really big promises as to what they're going to deliver, how they're going to solve all these problems, and then they're not able to follow through on it because they were never really realistic about what they could deliver, right? They were just, using their PR lines in order to buy public acceptance for these technologies that they're pushing on the public. And so I would argue that if we're thinking about how we're going to solve these problems, I think that electric vehicles have a part to play in addressing the climate part of it, because you're not going to get everyone out of a car tomorrow. And the climate crisis is really pressing and we need to address that. But I think that also we need to have a focus in ensuring that we actually have real, reliable, affordable, dependable alternatives for people to not have to rely on the car in cities in Australia, in North America, in Canada. So making real significant investments in public transit infrastructure so that you have that reliable alternative, making real investments in cycling infrastructure so that you can get around in that way, in dependable bike parking so you know that if you leave your bike somewhere, it's not going to get stolen from you, and in intercity transportation, so better rail networks, high-speed rail even, so that you can get between cities, not have to worry about taking a car or taking a plane or what have you. There are many investments that we can make, but this requires political will, right? It requires us to really recognize that there are decisions we need to make, investments we need to make. And when we look back at the history of the automobile, the only reason that the automobile takes over our cities is because the auto interests are very influential. Of course, they lobby, but because the government makes a lot of investments in highways, in roads, in subsidizing the infrastructure that makes that all possible, right? And so if we're going to reimagine the way that the transportation system works today, it's not just going to be by tech companies inventing some magical new technology that solves our problems. The government has to be in there and has to be making the investments, changing the incentives for how people get around.
It comes down to what is the problem you're trying to solve, really, doesn't it? We had a great discussion on cybernetics a couple of months ago now with Ellen Broad from ANU, and we were talking about the trolley dilemma. And as the cybernetic person, she said, well, why are we talking about driverless cars in the first place? What are the problems that we're trying to solve when we think about how to get around a city? And I'm also curious, with the disruption of the pandemic and work from home, whether those questions have changed.
It's really interesting, right? Because I feel like in the early part of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion around what our cities were going to look like in the future, right? How we were going to live in the future, if this was going to kind of give us a period to kind of reflect on the way that our society works and whether we were going to change things as a result. And then I think that, after about the first year or so of the pandemic, when a lot of places are kind of coming out of lockdown, going to a new normal. I know it was a little bit different in Australia because of the border measures that you had in place, maybe not so different in Melbourne. And it was quite different where I was as well, because we had some border measures here as well. So we lived actually very, very normal through much of the early part of the pandemic. And so, I think that discussion was there, that there was a lot of questioning around, the society that we had set up before, whether this was going to give us the opportunity to rethink things. But then I think after we go about a year and a half into the pandemic, there's a really strong push to get back to normal, right? To restore what already happened. In some cities, you had streets that were closed to cars and open to pedestrians because people needed to get out. They needed to social distance. They needed some fresh air. And what you saw very quickly as, things started to open back up was that there was a really strong push to ensure that the streets were closed to pedestrians again, reopened to the cars, this to treat this as though it was a really exceptional moment, but it was not going to really change, how we live. We're going to go back to the way that things were before. I think that there's still a kernel of that, right? And we can still pick up on it because people do remember that things can be different. And I think that there is a growing frustration with this new normal, quote unquote, that we're living, right? And certainly some cities have seized on that. I'm not sure the degree to which it has happened in Australia, but cities like Paris were able to significantly expand the degree of cycling by accelerating plans that they already had to restrict the amount of car traffic that happened on roads. And as a result, a lot more people bike around the city now. Montreal did something similar, not to the same degree. But there are opportunities to take advantage of these changes, the openness that people have to experience change, to living in a different way. But there also needs to be some political courage there to face down the interests that don't want things to change because they benefit from the status quo.
Yeah, there's a nice little, very classically French phrase, I think the mayor of Paris says, where she wants it to be a city where you can let go of your child's hand, without obviously being concerned that the child will be hit by a car. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things about this book as well that I think is compelling is that you can imagine that tech companies are only really responsible for transforming our online spaces. But here's a clear example of how they radically transform our physical world as well. And, you're talking there about, investment in public transit and stuff. And I think Sydney was the first city in the world to experiment with allowing you to put money on your Opal card, your public transport card in Sydney, that can then be used on an Uber. And one of the things I think that is interesting about this is here's a private company, like their philosophy is we're going to solve this market problem. We don't need public investment. And they then insert themselves into public investment programs as well, and how insidious it is. I think we're kind of looking at the legacy of neoliberalism, where the idea of public investment in major projects is seen as somehow passé. And then in fact, we should be leaving these problems to the market. But to my mind, Uber's solution is not one that is meaningful. It increases congestion, all this kind of stuff. But I know there's some interest from others in the chat about what you think about ride sharing. Paris, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. For me, I'm not a big fan. I've taken an Uber once in my entire life. And it was because a friend called it. And at that point, it's there. You're not going to say, I'm not going to get in it.
Terrible
right?
Hypocrite, Paris.
Well, right. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because really, when services like Uber, Lyft were launching, the narrative was really that they really needed to take on the entrenched taxi infrastructure, the way that taxi services worked, and they were going to make transportation a lot better as a result, right? You were going to have much easier access to these kind of on-demand services. And that was going to address traffic congestion in cities. It was going to make it cheaper and more affordable for people to get around. It was also going to reduce the transportation emissions. It was going to be complementary toward transit services. And what we've seen by continual studies in the United States, a few years later, because Uber wouldn't actually release any of its data and researchers had to develop ways to gather that data themselves. But they really found that all of the promises that Uber made about the services and the benefits that it was going to provide to the public were not realized. In cities across the United States, it was found that they increased traffic congestion. It didn't reduce it. It took riders away from public transit. It wasn't complementary toward it. And as a result, if you have people getting around in a private car instead of, a bus or a subway or something like that, they're adding traffic, right? Because they're taking up more space on the road as a result of that. What they also found was that it didn't tend to serve the kind of underserved populations in the city that Uber said it was going to prioritize. It actually fought for carve-outs from the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that it didn't have to properly serve people in wheelchairs. And it was found that the people who were best served by Uber service were young, college-educated people in cities earning above average incomes, which I like to say is your general tech worker, right? Finance worker, people like that. These are the people who are generally benefiting from these types of service. And it's not really a surprise, they're the people who are developing the service. So I don't think it's shocking to see that they're the ones who are most benefiting from it. And so I would say that there was a lot of promise that was made about these services, but they were not able to deliver on that. And then the other piece of it is, of course, is that, their promise was that it was actually a lot cheaper and more efficient than a taxi service. But what we found is that largely the reason that they were cheaper was because they were losing billions of dollars a year in order to subsidize the fares of those rides. And Hubert Horan, who's a transportation consultant who's been following Uber closely, actually argues that the taxi model is more efficient because you don't have these expensive headquarters. You don't have these big engineering teams developing these softwares. You actually have a fleet of vehicles that can be maintained in a more efficient way than having everyone own their own vehicle. And then the final point there, of course, is that what Uber really did was really attack the rights of the workers who were delivering these services, right? And, regardless of whether they stick around or not, one of their legacies is going to be trying to rewrite labor codes and labor laws and labor classifications the world over. And that, I think, is going to have negative implications for years to come as other companies try to take advantage of these carve-outs if they're able to successfully win them in places around the world. I know there's an ongoing fight in Australia about that, but they've so far been successful in California. They're making good progress here in Ontario and Canada. So I think it's really worrying.
Paris, there is, I wonder if there's an opportunity for governments and community organisations to take some of the best bits of Uber and other rideshare companies, though, to some extent. I mean, one of the things that I think that Uber has introduced, which is a real benefit, is the ability to share your rides with a few people who are going in roughly the same direction of you. And that's obviously been made possible by technology. It was something that wouldn't have been able to be done 10 or 15 years ago because you wouldn't have enough information to know who was going from one direction to the other. I wonder if there's an opportunity for, rather than what Lizzie was talking about, which is Uber sort of wheezing their way into the public transport system, but the other way around in the public transport system, perhaps adopting some of these more innovative ways of a more flexible work environment that isn't just buses and trains. I wonder if that's a way that we could perhaps improve things. Have you seen anything like that happening around the world?
So, yeah, it's entirely possible. I would say, you need to ensure that you have the proper regulations in place to protect the rights of the workers, to ensure that they're getting a fair pay, to ensure that they're getting, the proper classification, that they have the rights that they deserve, right? And that's a real problem with the Uber model right now. You could look at this through the lens of, cooperative approaches to delivering these services. I think you would still need regulations on the number of vehicles that can be on the road, because that's really what kind of drives down the prices. You have all these drivers kind of fighting against themselves. And it also is part of what creates the congestion, because if you just have as many people who are, looking to deliver the service, get onto the platform, hit the roads trying to find a ride, especially in a moment when there are economic crises, when people are struggling to, afford the basics that they need to live, then obviously that's going to cause a problem. But I would say that, I think, at least my experience is that there's a lot of taxi companies who have already started to adopt these kind of technological approaches to delivering the rides themselves. This isn't something that only exists with Uber or Lyft or ride-hailing services, so to speak. This kind of means of delivering the service can easily be replicated with taxi companies or another kind of structure for delivering, what is essentially a taxi ride, what we've long known as a taxi ride, but we've kind of started calling ride sharing in the past 10 years. So yeah, we can certainly use the technologies in other ways. We just need to have the proper regulations around how they're used, around the protections for the workers and all these sorts of things, which, we were basically told we didn't need by Uber and Uber's lobbyists. And I think we've kind of recognized the problem with believing them when they were claiming those things and lobbying in that way.
I used to have this great app before technology where I'd put my thumb out and people would pick you up and give you a lift into the... But there is a bit where you could do some of this stuff without the tech as well, couldn't you? I don't know.
Yeah, there's certainly no benefit to the economy of you just sticking out your thumb and getting a ride, right? It needs to be kind of turned into a transaction so that it can be recorded by the economy. It can contribute to GDP, all these sorts of things, right?
Hey, thanks for sharing some time with us so late at night. Congratulations again on the book. I encourage everyone to make use of our special discount offer, which Lizzie had up in the chat. And it's great to see somebody else joining what I think is the most important conversation, which is not just looking at the tech, but the political economy of the tech. And, more power to your pen, Paris, and look forward to staying in touch.
I really appreciate you inviting me and having me to chat. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dan and Lizzie. All right, guys. Have a great weekend. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms, a fortnightly podcast from the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. It was recorded live at a virtual town hall on October 14. If you'd like to attend one of these discussions in real life, you can register at centreforresponsibletechnology.org.au. Burning Platforms was produced on Gadigal land by Jennifer Macy. Talk again in a fortnight.